There are moments inside royal palaces that never make it into the history books. Not because they are unimportant, but because the people who witness them know, without being told, that some things are meant to stay buried inside stone walls and behind pressed uniforms. This is one of those moments. And the fact that it survived it all, that it leaked through the cracks of protocol and landed years later in the hands of people willing to tell it, says everything about how heavy a secret becomes when a child is the one carrying it. Princess Charlotte was 6 years old the afternoon it happened. 6 years old, which means she still had that particular kind of courage that adults spend their whole lives trying to remember. The kind that doesn't calculate risk. The kind that walks straight into a room full of grown-ups and says the thing no grown-up in that room has the spine to say. She was small enough that people underestimated her. She was Windsor enough that she noticed everything. The afternoon had started the way most formal royal afternoons start, with a schedule, with staff moving in tight formations, with the particular smell of old wood and fresh flowers that fills every corridor of a palace like a held breath. There had been a luncheon. There had been guests. There had been the long, choreographed performance of a royal family being a royal family in front of people who needed to believe that everything was fine, that everything was coordinated, that the institution was functioning exactly as it should. Charlotte had sat through most of it with the patience of a child who has been trained since birth to sit still and smile at the right moments. She was good at it, better than most adults expected. But she was also watching, always watching. Her eyes moved across rooms the way her great-grandmothers once did, cataloging, sorting, filing away. She had noticed the tension between the aides before lunch was even over. It was not the kind of tension that announces itself. Nobody raised a voice. Nobody made a scene. It lived in the small things, in the way one aide stepped slightly too close to another while delivering a message, in the way a folder was passed without eye contact, in the way 3 people on opposite sides of a corridor all turned their backs at the same moment when a 4th person walked in. Charlotte didn't have words for what she was reading, but she felt it the way children feel weather before it arrives, in her chest, behind her sternum, like pressure building against the door. The royal guard's name was Thomas Hendricks. He had been stationed at this particular palace for 4 years. He was the kind of man who occupied space without apologizing for it, broad through the shoulders, unhurried in his movements, with the specific posture of someone who has stood still for so many hours that stillness has become his natural state. He was not a dramatic man. He was not a man who pushed past people. In 4 years, nobody had ever seen him break rank for anything short of a direct security threat, which is why what happened that afternoon stopped every aide in the corridor cold. It started with a piece of paper. One of the senior aides, a woman named Margaret Fielding, who had worked in royal households for 11 years and had the particular brand of carefully managed competence that comes with that tenure, was moving through the East Corridor with a document that needed to reach a specific set of hands before a specific meeting began. She was not running. She was doing the royal staff version of running, which looks from the outside like a very purposeful walk, but involves the kind of internal urgency that makes your pulse visible in your throat. Hendricks was posted at the end of the corridor. He watched her coming. He watched the 2 junior aides flanking her. He watched the document in her hand, the way she held it slightly away from her body, the way her eyes were fixed on the door at the far end of the hall. He did not move. Not yet. Charlotte had slipped away from her minder. Not maliciously, not with any plan, the way 6-year-olds slip away, which is to say completely and without warning and entirely driven by some interior compass that adults cannot track. She had followed the corridor because she recognized the sound of Margaret Fielding's shoes on marble. She had always liked that sound. Purposeful, rhythmic, like something important was happening and she might be allowed to be near it. She was not supposed to be in the East Corridor. She came around the corner just as Fielding was 5 feet from Hendricks. And Charlotte heard it. She heard it because she was small and low and close to the baseboards where sound travels differently, and because she was Charlotte and Charlotte did not miss things. Fielding said something to the junior aide on her left. Something low, something meant to be swallowed by the ambient noise of a busy corridor. And the name she said was Camilla. It was not said with warmth. Charlotte stopped walking. She stood at the corner for a moment, tucked against the wall, processing. Her small face did the thing it always did when she was working something out. Very still, very focused, a slight tuck of the chin. Then, she straightened up, walked forward, walked directly to Hendrix, which meant walking directly into the path of three moving adults who were very much not expecting a 6-year-old to materialize in the middle of a formal corridor. Fielding stopped. The junior aide stopped. Everyone adjusted. The micro-choreography of people recalibrating around an unexpected royal presence. Charlotte looked up at Hendrix. Hendrix looked down at Charlotte. She leaned up. He was so much taller that she had to go up on the balls of her feet, and even then, she could only reach the bottom of his arm. So she tugged at his sleeve, once deliberate, the way she'd seen her father do when he wanted someone's full attention without making a production of it. Hendrix bent down. She cupped her hands around her mouth. She whispered into the space beside his ear. The words were, "Asterisk Camilla. I won't tell." Asterisk nobody in that corridor heard the words except Hendrix. What they saw was a royal guard, a man who in 4 years had never broken from his post for anything non-emergency. Straightened back up, looked directly at Margaret Fielding, and stepped forward. Not a step to the side, not a polite yielding of space. A step forward into the path of the document, into the path of Fielding and her two aides, shouldering past them in a way that was technically within the boundaries of his authority and also absolutely, unmistakably, a statement. The document did not make it to its meeting on time. Fielding stopped, recalculated, turned back the way she came with the expression of someone who has just run into a wall they did not see on the map. Charlotte watched her go. Then she turned and walked back the way she had come, her small shoes quiet on the marble, her face giving away nothing at all. Hendrix resumed his post. For several long seconds, the corridor was completely silent. The two junior aides looked at each other. They looked at Hendrix. They looked at the empty space where Charlotte had been standing. Neither of them said a word. This was the first and most important rule of royal service. You did not narrate what you had just witnessed. You filed it. You carried it. You did not speak of it in corridors where sound traveled. But they both knew what they had seen. A 6-year-old princess had walked up to a royal guard and whispered something that made him move. Not protocol, not a security threat, not a direct order from anyone in the chain of command above him. A child's whisper, and he had moved. What Charlotte knew, what she had understood from the fragment of Fielding's conversation that she was not supposed to hear, was something that the adults in that corridor had been dancing around for weeks. It had to do with Camilla. It had to do with a conversation that had taken place behind a closed door that was not as closed as the participants believed. It had to do with the particular cruelty that can live inside institutions. The way people who are technically serving the same family can use information as currency, can pass documents as weapons, can deploy the appearance of efficiency to do the work of something much less clean. Charlotte had not been told any of this explicitly. She was 6. But she was her mother's daughter, and her mother had spent years learning to read the architecture of things that were not being said. The document Fielding was carrying was not simply administrative. It contained a summary, compiled by persons who would later deny they compiled it, of Camilla's schedule of private meetings over the preceding 3 months. Not unusual on its face. Schedules were documented, but the summary had been annotated, and the annotations were the weapon. Small notations beside certain meetings, question marks, initials, cross-references to other documents that would only mean something to someone who already knew what they were looking for. It was the kind of thing that, in the wrong hands, could be used to suggest that Camilla was operating outside the knowledge of others, that she was keeping her own counsel in matters where counsel was expected to be shared, that she was, in the language of palace politics, which is never stated plainly, becoming a problem. Who had commissioned the annotations, nobody would ever say outright. Charlotte had not seen the document. She had heard the name, heard the tone, and understood, with the animal accuracy of a child who has grown up inside a family where survival sometimes looked like knowing which adults were lying, that something was happening to someone she loved, and that the people carrying that something through the corridor were not doing it for good reasons. She had not gone to her parents. She had not gone to her own protection officer. She had not cried or asked for help or done any of the things a 6-year-old is supposed to do when she encounters something too large for her. She had found Hendrix, because Hendrix, Charlotte had noticed over years of watching, was the kind of man who did the right thing even when nobody was grading him on it. She had watched him once on a public engagement quietly redirect a photographer who had gotten too close to a staff member's child. Not because the child was royal, not because anyone was watching, just because it was the right thing to do, and Hendrix was the kind of man who did it. She had filed that away. She had known, in the way children know things they cannot articulate, that he was safe, that he was trustworthy in the specific way that trust matters when you're small, and the adults around you are playing games you cannot fully see. So she had walked to him. She had whispered to him, and she had trusted him to understand. He understood. What Hendrix knew, what he had been piecing together from 4 years of posted silence in corridors where people forgot he was listening, was enough. He knew about the annotations. He knew who had been seen leaving the office where the summary was compiled. He knew that the meeting Fielding was trying to reach was not a routine briefing. And he knew that if that document arrived before certain other people had the chance to be in the room, the balance of a very delicate situation would tip in a direction that was not going to be good for anyone who deserved good things. He had been weighing it for 3 days. What he had not been able to do in 3 days of weighing was find a reason to act that fell within the boundaries of his role. He was a guard. He stood. He watched. He intervened in physical threats. He did not intervene in the political weather of a royal household. That was not his function. He had no standing. He had no authority. He had only what he knew, and knowing things you cannot act on is its own particular kind of weight. And then a 6-year-old came around a corner and whispered 3 words into the side of his face. Camilla, I won't tell. Asterisk, she was not asking his permission. She was not reporting a threat. She was doing something more sophisticated than either of those things. She was telling him that she already knew, that she was already carrying it, that she was not going to use it the way the people in that corridor were planning to use it, and that she needed him to understand that someone on the inside, someone small, someone overlooked, someone who was supposed to be in a different part of the palace entirely, was paying attention. She was also, in the only way available to a 6-year-old, giving him cover. If anyone asked why he had stepped forward, why he had blocked Fielding's path, why he had created a delay that ultimately caused the document to miss its window, he could say only that he had been attending to a member of the royal family in the corridor. Which was true, which was his job, which no one could argue with. She had handed him a reason, and she had trusted him to use it. The document was delayed by 47 minutes. In those 47 minutes, a phone call was made. 2 people who had not been scheduled to be in the meeting arrived. The annotations, when the document finally circulated, were reviewed by people who were now in a position to contextualize them rather than weaponize them. The particular moment of vulnerability that had been engineered dissolved because the timing that made it dangerous was gone. Nobody could trace it back to Hendrix. Nobody could trace it back to Charlotte. The 2 junior aides who had been in the corridor that day transferred out of the household within the year. Not because of this, or not only because of this, but because people who work in royal households develop a specific kind of discretion about what they choose to continue being adjacent to. Fielding stayed. She was too useful to lose and too careful to accuse. She carried on doing what she did, which was move efficiently through corridors and manage information and work in the gray spaces between what was permitted and what was not. She never mentioned the afternoon. She never mentioned Charlotte in the corridor. She never acknowledged that a royal guard had stepped in front of her in a way that was not an accident. She was a professional. Professionals absorb and recalibrate. But she walked differently in the East Corridor after that. Slower, more aware of the corners. Charlotte never mentioned it either. Not to her parents. Not to her brother. Not to anyone who could have turned it into a story, a reprimand, a lesson about what young princesses were and were not supposed to involve themselves in. She was 6 years old. She had done the thing. She let be done. Hendrix served at the palace for another 6 years after that afternoon. He retired with commendation. His service record was clean and entirely unremarkable, which is the highest compliment that can be paid to a man in his position. He had a daughter of his own, 8 years old when he retired. Curious, observant, the kind of child who noticed things in rooms full of adults. He thought about Charlotte sometimes when he watched her. The way a child's instinct, when it is not yet trained out of them, can cut through the architecture of an entire institution and land exactly where it needs to land. The way she had not flinched, had not hedged, had walked up to a grown man in uniform and said the thing that needed saying, and then walked away and let him carry the rest. He had never told anyone what she whispered. He never would. Some things earn the silence they get. The thing about palaces is that they remember. Not in the way people remember. Not with warmth or narrative or the particular softness that memory develops around the edges of things over time. Palaces remember the way stone remembers weather. They hold the shape of what has passed through them without commentary, without judgment, without any interest in whether the people who made the marks deserve to make them. Every corridor has a history that nobody documents. Every room has heard things that never reached the formal record. And the people who live inside those rooms, who grow up inside them, who learn to walk and talk and navigate the world inside walls that have stood for centuries, they carry that memory in their posture, in the way they hold a door, in the way they read a room before they walk into it. Charlotte carried it in her eyes. She was 7 now, almost 8, and she had changed in the way children change in that particular stretch of years. Not dramatically, not in a way that announced itself, but in the quiet accumulation of understanding that builds up in a child who pays attention. She was taller. Her face had settled into something that was already, even at 7, arranging itself into the particular composure that would eventually become recognizable to millions of people. But her eyes were the same as they had always been, watching, sorting, filing. The household had changed too in the months since the afternoon in the East Corridor. Changes in royal households don't announce themselves any more than they do in families, which is to say they announce themselves constantly and in every possible register to anyone who knows how to read the signs. New staff, adjusted schedules, the particular choreography of who sat next to whom at which table, and who walked slightly ahead of whom in the corridor now shifted by a degree or two. These things meant nothing to the outside world. Inside the walls, they meant everything. Camilla was different, not in any way that would make the newspapers, not in any way that could be named or pointed at. But Charlotte noticed. She noticed that the particular tightness that had lived in Camilla's shoulders for months, the tightness that most people interpreted as reserve, as the natural carriage of a woman who had spent years being careful, had eased by something that was not quite measurable, but was absolutely visible if you were Charlotte. She laughed more in small rooms. She said things in meetings that were slightly sharper than what she would have risked before, the kind of sharp that comes not from recklessness, but from a small, quiet confidence that she was permitted to occupy her own space. Charlotte registered this. She did not analyze it. She simply added it to the collection of things she knew. What she didn't know, what she was still working out, with the methodical patience of a child who has learned that most things reveal themselves if you wait long enough, was what had happened in the weeks after the corridor. She knew about the document delay in the way she knew about most things, partially impressionistically through the fragments of overheard speech and observed behavior that assembled themselves into something like understanding without ever quite becoming a complete picture. She knew Hendricks had moved. She knew Fielding had turned back. She knew the timing of something had shifted. She did not know what that something was, not precisely, and she had made no effort to find out. Finding out was not the point. The point had been the act itself, the recognition that something needed interrupting, and the willingness to be the one who said so. But the act had consequences that were still moving through the household like ripples across still water. One of them arrived in the form of a man named Edward Colville. Colville was not palace staff. He was the kind of person who existed in the orbit of royal households, a fixer, in the language of people who needed things fixed, though he would never have used that word. His official designation was something to do with communication strategy, which was the polite container for a job that actually involved managing the flow of information in and out of institutional spaces. He was good at it. He had been good at it for 20 years, across a variety of institutions that had needed information managed, and he was the kind of good at something that makes a person nearly invisible because nobody wants to examine too closely what makes them effective. He had arrived at the household quietly 3 weeks after the corridor incident, as part of a scheduled review of internal communications protocols. This was not unusual. Reviews happened. Staff accommodated them. Life went on. Charlotte had noticed him the way she noticed all new presences in her environment. Immediately, precisely, and without making it obvious that she hadn't noticed. She had clocked his entry point, the East Wing, where Fielding worked, his meeting schedule, which she gleaned from 2 separate overheard conversations, and the particular way he moved through rooms, which was the way of a man who was accustomed to being underestimated and had learned to use that underestimation as its own kind of access. She did not know what he was there to do, but she knew he was there because of something. People like Colville were always there because of something. The morning she heard his name connected to Hendricks was a Thursday. She was in the library, officially doing schoolwork, while simultaneously managing the ambient information of a household mourning the way she always did, which meant keeping one ear on the corridor while appearing entirely absorbed in a book about the formation of glaciers. Her tutor had stepped out. 2 members of staff passed in the hall. Their voices were low, but not low enough. Colville. Review. Guard in the East Corridor. That afternoon in November. She turned a page. The staff moved on. The corridor went quiet. Charlotte sat with the book open in front of her, the paragraph about glacial moraines unread, and understood that Hendricks was now in some variety of difficulty. Not official difficulty, not the kind that came with paperwork and formal review and consequences that could be cited. The kind that was less visible and therefore more dangerous. The kind where someone with Colville's particular skill set started asking questions that were structured to produce a specific answer, and the person being questioned was never told what answer was being sought. She thought about what Hendricks had done for approximately 4 seconds. Then she got up from the table, put the glacier book in her bag, and walked out of the library. Her protection officer, a quiet woman named Sion who had been with Charlotte for 2 years and had the particular quality of presence that the best protection officers develop, which is to say she was everywhere and nowhere and rarely felt like a constraint, fell in his step beside her in the hall. Charlotte said, "I want to go to the East Wing." Sion said, "For what reason, ma'am?" Charlotte said, "I want to look at the tapestries." This was plausible. Charlotte did look at tapestries. She looked at everything. Sion had long since learned that Charlotte's stated reasons for wanting to be in a particular place were not always the complete picture, but she had also learned that Charlotte's actual reasons were never worrying. She was not a child who needed to be managed. She was a child who needed to be accompanied. They walked to the East Wing. The tapestries were there. They were large and ancient and depicted hunting scenes that Charlotte had memorized years ago. She stood in front of one and appeared to study it. Sion stood at a professional distance, which was close enough to respond and far enough to allow the illusion of privacy. Hendricks was not posted in the East Wing that morning, but the corridor outside the East Wing's secondary meeting room was, and that meeting room was where she had gathered from 2 overheard fragments and 1 observed schedule that Colville was conducting his reviews. She waited. It took 11 minutes. She was very good at waiting. She had been trained in it since she could stand. Hendricks came around the corner from the service corridor with a cup of tea and the bearing of a man who had been asked to make himself available and was doing so with the particular composure of someone who has decided in advance not to be rattled. He saw Charlotte. He stopped. He adjusted his grip on the cup. Charlotte looked at him. She did not whisper this time. She did not move toward him. She simply looked at him with the direct, unhurried attention of a child who has something to communicate and enough confidence in the person she is communicating with to trust that the communication will land without words. Hendricks looked back at her. For 3 seconds, they simply regarded each other in the East Corridor. Then, Charlotte turned back to the tapestry and said, at a perfectly normal volume, to no one in particular, "The hunting scenes are different on this side. The deer are larger." Hendricks walked on, down the corridor, past the door of the meeting room. He paused at the end of the hall, turned, and walked back. As he passed the meeting room door again, his pace was slightly different, slower, more deliberate. He was listening, and because he was listening, he heard what was being asked inside, and because he heard what was being asked, he was able to adjust his answers when he went in. Not lie. Hendricks was not a man who lied, but there's a difference between a lie and the precise calibration of how much truth to volunteer, and in the space between those two things, Charlotte had given him something he had not had before: advance information about the shape of the trap. He went into the meeting room. He answered Colville's questions. He was, by every account that later filtered through the household's informal channels, cooperative, measured, and entirely unremarkable. He had nothing unusual to report about the afternoon of the East Corridor. He had attended to a member of the royal family. He had maintained his post. The document delay was not something he had any knowledge of. Colville had very little to work with. A review that had no findings became, officially, a review that confirmed standard protocol. That was that. Charlotte was back in the library by lunchtime, reading about glaciers. What she had done, what she understood she had done, even if she did not have the vocabulary for it, was something more complicated than a child helping a guard. She had deployed herself. She had used her own presence, her own attention, the simple fact of who she was, and what that meant in the architecture of the household, as a form of protection. Not a public protection, not an official one, a quiet one, the kind that operates through proximity and implication and the particular weight that a royal child's eyes carry when they rest on a person with a specific kind of intention. It was the first time she had done it consciously. It would not be the last. The other ripple that was still moving through the household, slower than the Colville situation, less visible, but in many ways more significant, had to do with Camilla herself. Camilla had heard, through the specific channels by which people in her position hear things they're not told directly, that something had happened in November. Not the details, not Charlotte specifically, but the shape of it, that a moment of vulnerability had been anticipated and interrupted by someone on the inside, someone small and overlooked and operating without official sanction. She did not ask questions. Asking questions was not how Camilla operated. She had spent years learning to absorb information without visibly reacting to it, and she was very good at it. But she had noticed that Charlotte looked at her differently. Or perhaps not differently. Perhaps Charlotte had always looked at her this way, and Camilla had simply not been paying the right kind of attention. Children were background in the performing life of a royal household. They were present and scheduled and managed, but they were not generally the ones doing the watching. The adults watched the children. That was the arrangement. Charlotte had reversed it, and Camilla, sitting across a lunch table from her on a Tuesday in February, found herself being looked at by a 7-year-old with the specific quality of attention that she had previously only experienced from people who were trying to understand her rather than manage her. It was disarming. It was also, underneath the slight discomfort of being seen so directly, something that felt unexpectedly like being accompanied. She said, passing the bread, "You're very quiet today, Charlotte." Charlotte said, "I'm thinking." Camilla said, "About what?" Charlotte considered this for a moment. Then she said, "Glaciers. How they move things without anyone seeing them move." Camilla looked at her for a long moment. She did not say anything. She took the bread back. She turned back to her plate. But something in her posture, that almost imperceptible easing that Charlotte had been tracking for months, eased by one more degree. Hendricks passed them in the corridor after lunch. He was in full dress, returning from an external posting, and he moved with the unhurried authority of a man who has come through something and emerged with his integrity intact. He did not look at Charlotte. She did not look at him. There was no acknowledgement between them that could be witnessed or interpreted. But Sion, who missed very little, noticed that Charlotte's stride changed for exactly 3 steps as they passed him. A slight squaring of the shoulders, the kind of unconscious posture adjustment that happens when someone moves through a space they have left their mark on. She said nothing. Sion never said anything unless saying something was required. But she logged it in the part of her mind that kept track of what Charlotte was becoming. She was 7 years old, almost 8. She was already becoming something that would be very difficult for the people around her to keep underestimating. The East Corridor had taught her something that no curriculum she was enrolled in covered. It had taught her that power does not always live in the official channels. That the people who carry documents through halls are not always the ones who determine where those documents land. That a well-placed presence, the right person in the right corridor at the right moment, can redirect the flow of things that seem unstoppable. And that none of this requires noise. None of it requires authority that has been formally conferred. It only requires attention. And the specific courage of acting before you're certain. Because certainty is a luxury that the people being protected cannot always afford to wait for. She thought about that sometimes. About the moment she had walked around the corner and heard Fielding's voice and understood, without analysis, without evidence, from pure pattern recognition, that something was wrong. She had not thought, I will intervene. She had not designed a plan. She had simply walked forward, and the walk had become an action, and the action had become a consequence, and the consequence was now living in the household like a shifted foundation, invisible from above, but changing the structure of everything built on top of it. It was a strange thing to know about yourself at 7. She went back to her glaciers. They moved things, glaciers, enormous things, without making a sound that any individual human could detect. By the time you could see what they had moved, they had already been moving for centuries. Charlotte found that deeply interesting. She also found, somewhere in the image of an enormous body of ice moving imperceptibly forward through a landscape, something that felt like recognition, like finding a metaphor for something that had been living in her without a name. She was not in a hurry. She was not going anywhere. She was already exactly where she needed to be. Outside the library window, the grounds were winter pale, and still, the trees stripped to their structure. Everything essential made visible by the absence of leaf and color. A gardener moved along the far fence line, head down against the wind, doing the work that nobody watched and everybody depended on. Charlotte watched him for a long time. Then, she opened her book, found her page. Read about how glaciers deposit what they carry slowly at the furthest point of their reach, and how the land that receives those deposits is permanently changed by them. Filed it. Moved on. The household had a word for the weeks after Christmas. They called them the Gray Weeks, which was not an official designation, but a shared one, the kind of name that develops organically inside any institution that operates year-round and knows the difference between the calendar's high points and the stretches between them. January and February, after the Christmas schedule collapsed and before the spring season began to build, were the weeks when the house exhaled, when the formal rhythm loosened its grip by a degree, when staff who had been performing at full ceremony for months were permitted to be slightly more human, and when the people they serve were permitted to exist in rooms without every moment being an occasion. It was in the gray weeks that Charlotte watched most carefully, because it was in the gray weeks that people forgot to perform, and in the space between performances, the real architecture of things became visible. Who sat next to whom at breakfast without being scheduled to? Which aides lingered in which offices longer than their duties required? Which relationships, professional, personal, occasionally adversarial, had shifted since December, and in which direction, and by how much? She was 8 now. She had been 8 for 6 weeks. Being 8 felt, to Charlotte, largely the same as being 7, except that she had a slightly better vocabulary for some of the things she had been observing and a slightly expanded radius of movement through the household. She had also, in the 6 weeks since the corridor incident had completed its slower consequences, the review, the recalibration, the quiet consolidation of positions, been paying attention to something new, something she had not had a framework for before, but which the last several months had given her the beginning of one. She was paying attention to Camilla's staff. Not Camilla herself. Camilla was a study she had been conducting for years. In the quiet way, she studied everyone she cared about, and she felt she had a reasonable map of Camilla's terrain, the textures of her courage and her caution, the specific ways her public composure and her private warmth existed in productive tension with each other, the things that genuinely delighted her versus the things she performed delight about because delight was required. She knew Camilla the way, someone you have watched at close range across a long stretch of time. What she was learning now was how the people around Camilla shaped the space she operated in. This was a different kind of knowledge. Harder, in some ways, because it required tracking multiple variables simultaneously, not just what each person did, but what they did in relation to each other, and what the combination of those things produced in the environment Camilla moved through every day. It was network thinking, though Charlotte would not have called it that. She would have said she was watching how rooms changed when different people were in them, which was the same thing. The gray weeks were useful for this because people were off script. She started with Marcus Webb. Webb was a senior aide in Camilla's office, one of the people whose role was to manage the flow of correspondence, appointments, and requests that arrived from outside the household. He was competent and apparently loyal and had been in his position for 3 years, which in the context of royal service was enough time to have developed both a thorough understanding of how things worked and a thorough map of where the pressure points were. He was the kind of person you would describe, if asked to describe him, as reliable, solid, not flashy, the kind of person who did not attract attention and did not seem to want it. Charlotte had watched Marcus Webb for 4 weeks before she noticed the pattern. It was small. It was the kind of thing that would have been dismissed, if noticed at all by someone less attentive, as irrelevant. But Charlotte was Charlotte, and what she noticed was this. Every time there was a meeting between Camilla's team and the broader household coordination staff, the meetings that happened every 10 days or so to align schedules and priorities, Marcus Webb arrived with his folder documents arranged in a specific order. First on top was always the item he expected to be most contentious. This was normal. This was strategy. You led with the thing you needed the most room to negotiate. What was not normal was that the item on top changed. Not from meeting to meeting. That would have been ordinary. Within meetings, she had seen it twice. The folder would be opened, the first item would be introduced, and then, at some point during the discussion, Webb would take a document from a lower position in the folder and place it on top of the others with the specific casualness of someone arranging papers rather than advancing an agenda. The discussion would shift. The item now on top would become the focus, and the thing that had been there before would settle to the bottom of the pile and often not resurface. It was elegant. It was almost invisible, but it was not accidental. She had seen it happen twice with items that related, in different ways, to Camilla's engagement schedule, specifically to a series of commitments that Camilla had expressed genuine interest in, things that aligned with causes she genuinely cared about rather than with the institutional priorities that were often assigned to her. The items had entered the meeting as priorities and left as deferred items. The deferring had looked organic. It had not been organic. Charlotte turned this over for several days. She was not certain. She was 8, and she was operating from observation without access to the contents of the folder or the broader context of the negotiations. It was possible she was misreading the pattern. It was possible Webb had legitimate reasons for the adjustments that she simply could not see from her position. It was possible her instinct about him was wrong. It was also possible it was right. She sat with the uncertainty. This was one of the harder disciplines she was developing. The ability to hold a suspicion without acting on it prematurely, without the impatience that wanted to name a thing the moment she spotted it. Wrong action taken with right instinct could do as much damage as right action taken at the wrong time. She had learned this from the November afternoon. In the aftermath, Hendricks had needed information to know how to answer Colville, and she had been able to give it to him only because she had waited until she had something specific to give. If she had gone to him earlier, with only the vague sense that something was wrong, there would have been nothing to give. So she waited. She also, quietly, started paying attention to whom Marcus Webb talked to outside of scheduled meetings. This was harder to do than the folder observation, which had taken place in spaces she moved through naturally. Webb's informal conversations happened in corridors and side rooms and the edges of spaces that were not her natural territory. She could not be in those places without it being visible. She had to catch fragments, which meant she had to be in motion, moving through the household on the legitimate errands of an 8-year-old princess, which included going to, and from lessons, going to, and from meals, going to the library, going to the stables on Tuesday and Thursday afternoons. In 3 weeks of motion, she gathered 4 fragments. The first was a name. Webb, in the corridor outside the second-floor staff kitchen, on his phone, using a name that Charlotte filed immediately without reacting to it. The name was Colville. The second was a phrase, overheard through a half-open door, the timing of the spring commitments. Not dramatic, not obviously sinister, but, in the context of what she already knew about the folder pattern, significant. The third was a behavior. Webb, spotted twice in the vicinity of Fielding's into the building during hours when there was no official reason for him to be there. Not in Fielding's office, in her vicinity, which was different and maybe nothing and maybe not nothing at all. The fourth was a look. At the 10-day meeting, 3 weeks into February, Webb caught Charlotte's eye across the room for approximately 1 second before his attention returned to his folder. She had not been staring at him. She had been sitting in the corner doing what she often did at these meetings, occupying her permitted peripheral presence, visible enough to be normal and quiet enough not to be disruptive. But he had looked, and the quality of the look, she registered it in the same part of her that registered all these things, had something in it that was not quite comfortable, something that recognized her as a variable he had not calculated for. She looked away immediately. She looked at the window. She appeared to be distracted by something outside, but she had registered it, and she added it to the collection, and the collection now had enough pieces in it to produce a shape, even if she could not yet see the whole shape clearly. That evening, she asked her mother, at dinner, in the way she often asked things, without preamble and without signaling the question's weight, whether it was possible to change someone's priorities without them knowing you were doing it. Her mother had looked at her, not with alarm. Kate was very good at receiving Charlotte's questions without alarm, which was one of the things Charlotte valued most about her, with the specific quality of attention that meant she was taking the question seriously. She said, "What kind of priorities?" Charlotte said, "The kind where they think they decided." But actually someone else decided. Her mother was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "It's possible. People do it all the time. Sometimes on purpose, sometimes without realizing." Charlotte said, "How do you know which is which?" Kate said, "Usually by watching what they gain." Charlotte thought about this. Then she said, "What if what they gain is not obvious?" Kate said, "Then you watch longer." Charlotte nodded. She ate her dinner. She did not ask another question that evening. But she sat with her mother's answer the way she sat with all the things she gathered, carefully in the part of her mind that was always working, always cross-referencing, always looking for the shape underneath the surface of things. What did Marcus Webb gain? She did not know yet. She did not know if the spring commitments he was apparently working to delay or defer were connected to the November document. She did not know if his relationship with Colville was professional residue from the review or something with its own ongoing purpose. She did not know if Fielding was a connection or a coincidence. She did not know enough to do anything with what she had. What she did know was that Hendricks was still in the household. He had come through the Colville review intact. He had resumed his posting. He was, to all visible observation, unchanged, the same unhurried presence, the same still authority, the same composure that did not announce itself. But Charlotte had been watching him with the same attention she gave everything else, and she had noticed something that she was not sure anyone else had noticed. Hendricks was watching Webb, not constantly, not in any way that could be named, but he had shifted his patrol patterns slightly, shifts so small they would only register to someone who had memorized his original patterns, and the shifts consistently place him in corridors that Webb moved through. He was gathering the same way Charlotte was gathering, from a different angle, with different access, but toward the same general destination. He had known something was unresolved. He had, apparently, been watching for what came next. Charlotte felt something move through her chest when she understood this, something that was not quite pride, and not quite relief, and was most accurately described as the sensation of not being alone in a room you thought you were alone in. The sensation of company, of someone else having arrived at the same location by a different route. She did not seek him out. She did not need to. She trusted that he would do what he did in November, hold the knowledge, wait for the right moment, act without making a production of the action. She trusted it because she had watched him for 3 additional months, and he had given her no reason not to. She trusted it the way she trusted very few things, not blindly, but on evidence, on the accumulated weight of a person's behavior in moments when their behavior was not being graded. She kept watching Webb. Hendricks kept watching Webb. Between the two of them, in parallel, without coordination, they were building a picture of something that was not yet ready to be named. The gray weeks moved toward March. The spring schedule was announced. Camilla's engagement list, as it was finally distributed, was missing 3 of the commitments she had been most vocal about wanting to include. They had been replaced by 3 others, worthy commitments, appropriate ones, but chosen from a different set of priorities than Camilla's own. Nobody could point to a specific decision. The substitutions had happened through the accumulated weight of dozens of small adjustments. The folder movements, the deferred discussions, the timing of recommendations that arrived before alternatives had been properly considered. It looked like administration. It functioned like control. Charlotte looked at the spring schedule on the day it was distributed. She read the list twice. She noted what was missing. She folded the paper and put it away and went to her afternoon lesson, which was French, and she was very good at French, and her tutor said so, and she thanked him in French, and she went home. She sat at her window that evening and looked at the garden, which was showing its first green. Early crocuses, brave and purple against the gray of the path. Glaciers moved slowly. They moved enormous things, and the land they moved through was never quite the same after they had passed. She was 8 years old. She was not going anywhere. She was in the language of the thing she was only beginning to understand about herself, already in motion. March came in the way it always did in England, grudgingly, with cold mornings that refused to acknowledge that the calendar had turned, and then, sometimes in the same afternoon, with a warmth that arrived without warning like a word of unexpected kindness from someone you hadn't expected kindness from. The grounds went from gray to tentatively green. The staff, who had been indoors and compressed for months, expanded slightly. Doors left open longer, voices carried further in the corridors, the whole household breathing out by a degree. Charlotte used the openness of March the way she used everything. She had been thinking about the spring schedule for 3 weeks. Not obsessively. She was 8, and she had lessons and meals and the full ordinary life of a child that ran alongside the other things she was quietly doing, but with the consistent background attention that she applied to things she had not yet resolved. The missing commitments sat in the back of her mind the way unfinished sentences sit in the back of the mind of someone who knows that the sentence is not done, but has not yet found the next word. She had watched Webb continue his folder rotations through 2 more coordination meetings. She had watched Hendricks continue his adjusted patrol. She had watched Camilla move through the household with the public composure that was her professional inheritance, and the private ease that had become, since November, since the thing that had happened without Camilla knowing what it was, slightly more accessible, slightly more present. She had watched all of this and continued adding to the picture without yet knowing what to do with the completed picture when it arrived. The thing that changed her timeline was a conversation she was not supposed to hear. She was in the music room, which was on the 2nd floor of the residential wing, practicing the piece she had been working on for 3 weeks, a Schubert impromptu that was technically within her reach, but emotionally several years ahead of her, which her teacher had acknowledged and assigned anyway on the grounds that playing toward something was better than playing within it. She was working on the 3rd section, which required a kind of sustained softness that she had not yet found, when she heard voices in the corridor outside. The music room door was not quite closed. She had left it ajar because she found practicing in a fully closed room pressurizing in a way she disliked. The corridor outside the music room was a secondary passage that connected the residential wing to the administrative corridor where several of the household offices were clustered. It was not a main thoroughfare. People used it when they wanted to move between those two sections without going through the formal halls. Two voices. She stopped playing. Not dramatically. She let the phrase in naturally, the last chord decay, and then she sat with her hands in her lap and listened. The first voice was Webb. The second voice, lower, faster, with a specific clip quality of someone who was used to speaking in spaces where they could not be overheard and had not fully registered that this particular space was not as private as they assumed, was Colville. She did not catch all of it. The corridor had its own acoustic geography, and parts of what they said folded into the distance before they reached her. But she caught enough. She caught the phrase autumn review. She caught the word principals, used in a way that meant the senior members of the family rather than school officials. She caught clearly and without ambiguity the phrase before the summer visit. And she caught, in Webb's voice, with a quality in it that was different from the measured professional tone she had heard in meetings. Lower, more certain, the voice of a man confirming something that had already been agreed rather than discussing something still in progress. For words that she added to the collection and did not move from for a long time after the footsteps had passed. The four words were, "She won't notice yet." Charlotte sat at the piano for another 10 minutes after the corridor went quiet. She did not resume playing. She sat with her hands in her lap and the unfinished Schubert waiting on the stand and thought about the four words and the particular pronoun that was their core. She could not know, with certainty, who the she was. But she had a collection. The collection had shape, and the shape had a center. She went to her lesson that afternoon and was attentive and well-behaved and asked a perceptive question about the romantic period that her teacher found genuinely impressive. She had dinner with her family and was pleasant and participated in the conversation and did not appear preoccupied. She had her bath and her reading time and said good night to her parents and went to sleep. In the morning, she woke up and knew what she needed to do. She needed to talk to Hendrix. Not whisper, not a corridor intercept, an actual conversation, which presented a problem because actual conversations between royal guards and 8-year-old princesses were not a thing that happened in the architecture of palace life. They existed in the same building. They occupied the same physical space. They operated in entirely different functional zones, and the crossing of those zones in either direction, for any reason that could be named, was the kind of thing that got noticed and remarked upon and occasionally written in reports. She thought about this for a day. The solution, when it came to her, was so simple that she was briefly disappointed in herself for not seeing it immediately. She dropped her gloves. It was the following Tuesday, late morning, and she was returning from session with her tutor in the East Wing study, the long route back to the residential wing, which she had chosen specifically because the long route passed through a section of corridor where Hendrix was posted on Tuesdays. She was wearing her winter coat because March was still cold and her mother insisted on coats until April. The gloves were her own, not the formal ones, soft charcoal gray, the kind with the slight texture at the fingertips that she liked. She dropped one, approximately 4 feet from Hendrix, let lie on the floor for a moment, then looked at it, looked up, and looked at Hendrix with the same direct, unhurried quality of attention she had used in the East Corridor 8 months ago. He picked up the glove. He brought it to her. He crouched slightly to present it at a height that made sense for her. Their faces were approximately a foot apart. She took the glove. She said, very quietly, in a tone she calibrated for just the two of them. He said she won't notice yet. Colville. He was talking to Webb. Before the summer visit. Autumn review. She held his eyes for 2 seconds. She stood up straight. She put on her glove. She said, at normal volume, "Thank you." She walked on. Sion, 3 steps behind, had watched the glove drop and be retrieved and said nothing because retrieving dropped items from royals was a normal household interaction and there was nothing in the exchange to flag. Hendrix resumed his post. Charlotte walked back to the residential wing and spent the rest of the morning drawing in her sketchbook, which she did when her mind was working on something and needed her hands to be occupied. She drew the music room window. She drew the garden crocuses. She drew a glacier, which looked like a lumpy mountain, which she added detail to until it looked more like what she meant, which was something very large that was moving without appearing to move. She did not know what Hendrix would do with the information. She had given it to him because it was his to have, because he was already watching, and the information she had would tell him something about the shape and timeline of what he was watching, and because she trusted, on the basis of every piece of evidence she had gathered, that he would know what to do with it better than she could do with it alone. What Hendrix did over the following week was move carefully and completely. He had channels that Charlotte did not have. He had relationships that had been building for 4 years in the specific network of trust that develops between the people who keep a household physically secure and the people responsible for its broader integrity. He was not a political operator, but he knew people who needed to know the same things he now knew, and he knew how to get information to them in a way that did not trace back to its source. By the 3rd week of March, 2 things had happened. The first was that a set of questions arrived on the desk of the person responsible for reviewing the household's administrative processes. Not from Hendrix, not from anywhere that could be connected to Hendrix, but questions specific and structural about the protocols around the autumn review and the engagement schedule and the process by which deferred commitments were handled. Bureaucratic questions, the kind that had legitimate procedural answers, the kind that, in the process of being answered, would require the people answering them to produce documentation that would, in turn, tell a larger story. The second was that Marcus Webb requested a transfer. He did not give a detailed reason. Transfers were not unusual. The household processed the request with the same professional efficiency. It processed everything. And within 10 days, Webb was being absorbed into a different administrative structure in a different part of the household estate, where his particular skills with document management and meeting choreography could be applied to situations that did not involve Camilla's engagement calendar. Colville did not return. Charlotte did not know, specifically, what Hendrix had done. She did not need to. What she had was outcomes, and the outcomes told her enough. The spring schedule remained what it was. The 3 commitments had already been substituted and could not be gracefully undone without creating a different kind of problem. But the autumn review, whatever it was being prepared for, had lost 2 of its architects. The questions sitting on the administrative desk would slow it. The documentation it required to answer would illuminate it. And the summer visit, whatever was being planned for before the summer visit, now had fewer people positioned to execute it. She sat with this and tried to assess it honestly. It was incomplete. She knew that. There were things she could not see from her position, people she did not know about, layers of what was happening that she had only glimpsed. She had not stopped anything, definitively. She had slowed something. She had changed the odds of something. She had protected someone she loved, not with a wall between them and a threat, but with a small, careful repositioning of information in the hands of people who could use it. She was 8 years old, and she understood, with the kind of clarity that arrives when you have been paying very close attention to something for a very long time, that protection was rarely the dramatic act, rarely the person throwing themselves in front of a danger. Usually it was quieter. Usually it was the glove dropped at the right moment. The 4 words passed at the right distance. The adjustment of where a piece of information sat in the order of things. It was glacial. It was, in the truest sense of the word, she had been sitting with for months, glacial. The movement was enormous and entirely invisible, and the land it moved through would be permanently changed, and nobody watching in real time could see it happening at all. She went to the stables on Thursday. She rode her horse around the ring for 40 minutes and felt the cold air on her face and the reliable animal warmth of a creature that did not require anything from her except her attention and her weight. She was good at riding. She was disciplined about it. She liked the way a horse responded, not to words, but to the subtler language of pressure and balance and the quality of your breath. She thought about Camilla on the way back from the stables. She thought about the 3 spring commitments that were gone. She thought about whether there was a way to address that specifically at some point, not now, not soon, but eventually. She had a long time. That was the thing she was gradually understanding about her own position in the world. She had an enormous amount of time. She was 8. She would be 9, and then 10, and then 20, and then 30, and the household would still be there, and the relationships within it would still matter, and the person she was building herself into carefully, quietly, with the same glacial patience she applied to everything, would still be in motion. She was not in a hurry. She went inside. She washed her hands. She went to lunch. Camilla was at lunch. They sat, as they sometimes sat, at adjacent seats in the informal arrangement of a household midday meal. Charlotte passed the salt without being asked. Camilla thanked her. They talked about the garden, which was changing, and about a book Camilla was reading, which Charlotte had not read, but asked questions about in a way that produced a real answer rather than a polite summary. At one point, Camilla put down her fork and looked at Charlotte with a quality of attention that was, for just a moment, not the polished public quality of a woman who had spent years learning to manage her own face, but something more interior, more unguarded, more genuine. She said, "You're a very unusual 8-year-old. Charlotte said, "I've been told that." Camilla smiled. She picked up her fork. She said, "I mean it as the highest compliment." Charlotte said, "I know." She looked at her plate. She ate. The room around them was full of the ordinary ambient life of people having lunch, voices, cutlery, the particular warmth of a house in which people live. She was 8 years old. She had kept her promise. Years later, when Hendrix was retired and his daughter was in university, and the particular world of the household he had served felt like something that existed behind glass. Visible, familiar, but separated from the present by the thick barrier of time, he would sometimes sit in his garden in the early evening and think about the East Corridor. Not because it haunted him. It did not haunt him. He was not a man given to haunting. But it stayed with him in the specific way that certain moments stay, not as regret, not as pride exactly, but as a kind of reference point, a fixed star by which he occasionally navigated the question of what it meant to do the right thing in a situation where doing the right thing required you to act outside the lane that had been drawn for you. He had been outside his lane that afternoon. He had known it when he did it. He had known it when Colville reviewed him. He had known it every day afterward, when he resumed his post in the corridor and went about the business of being a royal guard, which was a job that did not include moving based on the whispered words of 6-year-olds or the accumulated moral weight of 4 years of listening to things he was not supposed to be listening to. He had been outside his lane, and he had acted anyway, and the consequences had been ultimately manageable, in part because Charlotte had thought to give him cover, and in part because the thing he had been protecting had been worth protecting, and the world occasionally recognizes that and responds accordingly. What stayed with him was not the act. What stayed with him was the child. He had met, in 4 years of royal service, a great many people who operated inside institutions and believed from inside those institutions that the institution was the thing, that the structures and protocols and official channels were not just the method but the meaning. He had met people who were very good at their jobs precisely because they had this belief, and people who were less good at their jobs because they had this belief too rigidly. And he had met people who had learned over years to hold the belief more loosely, to know when the protocol served the purpose and when it blocked it. He had never, before Charlotte, met someone who seemed to arrive already knowing. She was 6 years old. She had walked into a complicated institutional situation, read it with an accuracy that would have been impressive in a 40-year-old, identified the one lever available to her that could interrupt what was happening, and pulled it. And then she had walked away. She had not needed recognition. She had not needed him to confirm that she had done the right thing. She had done it, let it go, and moved on with the ease of someone who was not doing it to be seen doing it, but simply because it needed doing. He had children. He understood, from having children, the enormous variation in what children were capable of at different ages. He understood that some children were observant, and some were not, that some had instincts that outpaced their years, and some developed more linearly. He was not romantic about childhood in general. He was specific about this child in particular. She was someone the world was going to need to pay attention to. He thought about that often, in the evenings in his garden. He thought about what she would become, not with any particular prescience about the specifics of it, but with the general conviction of a man who has spent his life reading people and knows when he is reading someone who will matter. He also thought more privately about what it had cost her to know what she knew at the age she knew it. Because that was the other side of it, the side that the garden evenings sometimes brought forward. The gift and the cost. The watching, the cataloging, the constant pattern recognition that she was so extraordinarily good at. It required something from a child. It required the kind of sustained attention to adult dynamics that should not, ideally, be required of someone who is 6, 7, 8 years old and should have been permitted to exist in the world with less vigilance. She had not been permitted that. Not because she had been denied it, but because she was who she was inside what she was inside, and the institution she was born into did not pause its machinations for the comfort of its youngest members. She had adapted. She had turned her awareness into a tool, and the tool was extraordinary, and it was hers. But he was old enough to know that the tools we build from necessity are shaped by the necessity, that you cannot always separate the gift from the wound that produced it. He did not know if Charlotte would ever have words for this. He suspected she might not want them. He suspected that she had already, at 8 years old, made the calculus and decided that the watching was worth what it asked of her, and that she would not trade it, and that was a decision she was entitled to make. It was hers. He had never told anyone what she whispered. He would take it to his grave, and he felt no conflict about this. It was not a secret that weighed on him. It was a secret that belonged to her, and keeping it was simply an extension of the loyalty he had felt in that corridor, the loyalty to a person who had trusted him with something that required trust. She had been 6. She had handed him a tool and trusted him to use it well. The least he could do for the rest of his life was be the person she had accurately determined him to be. His daughter asked him once, home from university for the weekend, sitting at the kitchen table with her hands around a mug of tea, what the most interesting thing that had ever happened to him in his career was. She was studying political science. She was interested in institutions and how power moved through them in the gap between how things were supposed to work and how they actually worked. They had good conversations, the two of them, about these things. He thought about how to answer her. He said, "I once had a very young person trust me with something that required me to act against my own professional instincts." His daughter said, "And you did it?" He said, "I did." She said, "Was it the right call?" He said, "Yes." She said, "How did you know?" He thought about this for a long moment. Outside the kitchen window, the evening was settling into the garden, the light going the particular gold of late spring that he had always found beautiful without ever finding adequate words for. He said, "Because the person who trusted me was very good at reading people, and they had read me accurately. And when someone sees you that clearly, when they know at a level that bypasses all the performance of it, exactly who you are, the only honest response is to be that person." His daughter looked at him for a moment. Then she said, "That's the most interesting thing you've ever said to me." He picked up his tea. He never told her who it was. Charlotte, by the time those evening conversations were happening in Hendrix's garden, was older. Not old. She was still young by any measure that mattered, but old enough to look back at the years of the East Corridor with a perspective that age and accumulation make possible. She did not do this often. She was not a person who spent much time looking backward, but occasionally, in the specific quiet of a room where she was alone and not required to perform anything, the memory would come back to her with the particular clarity of things that mattered. She remembered the weight of the decision in the corridor, not the complexity of it. It had not felt complex in a moment. It had felt simple in the way that urgent things sometimes feel simple. This needed to happen. She could make it happen, so she did. The complexity came later in the days and weeks of managing what the act had set in motion, and in a longer-term understanding of what the act had revealed about who she was and how she moved through the world. She had been 6 years old, and she had understood in the marrow of a moment that waiting for someone with more authority to act was not an option because the person with more authority might not see what she could see, and what she could see was enough, and she was there, and she was the only one who was both able and willing to do the thing. She had found a royal guard she trusted, and she had handed him 3 words and trusted him with the rest. What she had not known at 6 was how rare that was. Not the act. Acts of instinctive protection happen constantly in families and institutions and communities. But the combination of seeing clearly enough to know what was needed, trusting accurately enough to know who to give it to, and releasing it cleanly enough to let someone else carry the part they were built to carry, that combination was something that most people spent years developing, if they developed it at all. She had shown up with it at 6. She had spent the years since learning what it was called, learning to name the thing she did naturally so that she could do it more precisely, more deliberately, with less chance of the quiet errors that instinct makes when it runs unchecked by understanding. She had studied the architecture of institutions not because she was fascinated by institutions in the abstract, but because she lived inside one, and the architecture determined everything. She had studied the way power moved, the official channels, and the unofficial ones, the documents that traveled in straight lines, and the ones that traveled in the shapes of whatever served the person carrying them. She had studied what trust looked like and what it required and how to build it in a way that held under pressure. She had done all of this study in a way that had always been natural to her, quietly, while appearing to be doing something else, filing what she learned in the part of herself that was always working. The household she moved through now was the same household in many of its essentials, the same corridors, the same rhythms, the same underlying grammar of loyalty and protocol, and the constant performance of institutional health. But she moved through it differently than she had at 6, with more knowledge, more precision, more ability to read the large-scale patterns that the small ones pointed toward. She was better, in every technical sense, at the thing she had done in the corridor. What she tried not to lose, what she tended in herself with the same attention she tended everything else, was the quality of the original act, the directness of it, the willingness to move before she was certain, because certainty was a luxury the people being protected could not afford to wait for. The cleanness of giving what she had to the right person and stepping back and trusting them to do their part. She had learned, over the years, that this was the part most people found hardest. Not the act itself. Action, when you were clear about the need for it, was in many ways the easier part. The hard part was the after, the letting go. The trusting that what you set in motion would land the way it needed to, that the person you had chosen was as trustworthy as your reading of them told you they were, that the outcome was going to be okay, even though you had no control over the outcome, and never would. She had been good at that part even at 6. She was still good at it. She had kept her promise to herself that morning in the corridor, not to tell, not to use what she knew as currency in the palace economy of information, not to leverage it for anything. She had kept it because the keeping was part of the act. The silence was part of what she had given Camilla, who would never know she had given it. The discretion was part of what she had given Hendrix, who had carried it faithfully and given her back something worth more than the information itself. He had given her evidence that she could be trusted, not just that she could read people well enough to trust them, that she herself was trustworthy, that when a 6-year-old made a choice in a corridor, the people she chose would hold up their end, that she was not naive, that her instincts were built on something real. This was not a small thing to know at 6. It was not a small thing to know at any age. Most people live their whole lives uncertain of it, uncertain whether their reading of other people was accurate, uncertain whether they themselves were the person they believed themselves to be. She had tested herself in that corridor without knowing she was testing herself, and the test had come back with a clear answer. She was who she thought she was. She was trustworthy enough to be trusted. She was good enough at reading people to give the right thing to the right person. And she was patient enough and quiet enough and willing enough to let her actions live in the world without needing to be seen taking them, to let the glacier move without standing on top of it and announcing the direction. The East Corridor had given her all of this. A conversation that took less than 30 seconds. 3 words in the ear of a man she had assessed correctly. A document delayed by 47 minutes. A small, quiet redirection of something that wanted to flow in a direction it should not flow. Nothing dramatic. Nothing that made any record anywhere. Nothing that the history books would ever contain. The households of powerful families are full of these moments. The decisions that look like non-decisions. The conversations that look like coincidences. The people who move at the exact right time for the exact right reasons, and then step back and let the world arrange itself around what they have done and ask nothing in return. Charlotte was one of those people. She had been one of them since she was 6 years old. She would go on being one of them for the rest of her life, in rooms that would grow larger and contexts that would grow more complex and on scales that the East Corridor could not have predicted. She would do it with increasing skill and precision and the specific authority that comes from decades of paying attention. She would do it when it was easy and when it cost her, which was most of the time, because the things worth protecting are rarely easy to protect, and the people who are good at protecting them are rarely the ones who find it convenient. She would do it the way she did everything, quietly, completely, and without once breaking her word. Some things earn the silence they get. Some promises, made in 3 words to no one, but the person you are becoming, hold longer and run deeper than the ones made with ceremony and witnesses and the full apparatus of an institution watching. She had made one in a corridor. She had kept it. That was all there was to it. That was everything.